The answer is because I care deeply about making a positive difference in helping the most vulnerable and supporting those who are most in need.
Camilla's grandson had just done something unforgivable at one of the most celebrated royal events on the British calendar. What he did was so disgraceful that Catherine dragged him out herself before the damage could grow any worse. But nobody was prepared for what happened next. Camilla came storming in to stop Catherine dead in her tracks. Catherine held her ground and did not move an inch. What she said to Camilla's face in that moment was so brutally honest that Camilla had nothing left to say. And what followed between these two women was darker than anything this royal family had seen in years. The night Freddie Parker Bowles broke St. George's Hall there are rooms in this world where you do not mess up. St. George's Hall at Windsor Castle is one of them. Kings have eaten in that room. Wars have been discussed at that table. Alliances that redrew the map of the world were sealed in that very hall. Some of the most powerful people alive have sat there and kept themselves composed. And on this night, a 15-year-old boy was about to tear through all of it. Freddie Parker Bowles had been given his seat in that hall because his grandmother was Camilla, Queen Consort of England. And that privilege carried one expectation above all others. Stay on your best behavior and never become the story. Freddie became the story before the second course had even been cleared. The drinking started first, and it was not subtle. Freddie was not sneaking quiet sips and hoping nobody noticed. He was reaching across the table with the easy confidence of someone who had never been denied much of anything, grabbing wine glasses and pouring spirits as though the evening had been arranged especially for him. And with every course that arrived, he became louder. His voice, which had already started the evening at a noticeable volume, kept rising. The guests nearest to Freddie began exchanging glances. The footmen, trained to appear almost invisible, were watching every movement, and the question quietly spreading through that section of the hall was not simply, "What is this boy doing?" It was, "Who is responsible for him, and why has no one stopped him yet?" But the drinking was only the beginning. As the alcohol settled in, and whatever restraint Freddie had brought into the evening completely fell away, he turned his attention toward the women serving the banquet. The female staff at a state banquet are experienced professionals, performing demanding work inside one of the most pressurized environments in the country. They move through that hall with precision, discipline, and quiet dignity. At the very least, they deserve basic human respect. But Freddie looked directly at one of those women and tore that minimum apart. At one point during the meal, a female staff member leaned across to clear a plate near Freddie's seat. He looked her straight in the face and told her she should learn how to do her job properly and pay closer attention to what she was doing. He said it with the cold, flat certainty of someone who believed the woman standing before him was so far beneath him that humiliating her publicly would carry no consequences. Two foreign dignitaries, seated close enough to hear every word, turned toward each other and said absolutely nothing, which in diplomatic language can be one of the loudest reactions possible. The staff member straightened herself, said nothing, and continued working. As if that were not already disastrous enough, Freddie then pulled out his phone. At a white tie state banquet, a phone appearing at the table is the kind of breach that would make even a footman's supervisor tense. The atmosphere is too formal, too carefully controlled, and far too sensitive. But Freddie did not simply place his phone on the table. He pointed it toward the room and began filming. The camera swept across a hall filled with foreign ambassadors, senior diplomats, and members of the royal family engaged in conversation. A guard immediately moved toward him to take the device, but Freddie quickly shoved it into his pocket and shot the man a hard glare. By then, the hall had reached a very specific and dangerous kind of tension. A slow, spreading horror moved from table to table as guests realized this boy was not going to stop on his own and that somebody would have to intervene. Catherine had already received 2 separate warnings from staff. The first came during the reception before dinner, when a footman supervisor quietly passed word to her household that Freddie's behavior was already becoming a concern. Catherine acknowledged the message and chose to observe. She gave Freddie the benefit of the doubt, believing he might regain control of himself. But just 40 minutes into the dinner, a second warning arrived through the staff channel. Catherine was already watching Freddie when the message reached her. What she did next had nothing to do with impulse, frustration, or shock. She stood from her seat and began walking across the room. That detail alone says everything. Because at a white tie state banquet, nobody does that. The evening is carefully designed around the assumption that once seated, guests remain seated. Every element of service depends upon it. So when Catherine rose from her chair and moved through St. George's Hall with quiet, unwavering purpose, everyone whose eyes caught that movement felt something shift inside them. What they were about to witness had never happened at an event like this before. But what made that night even darker than one badly behaved teenager losing control at a formal dinner was this. Freddie had behaved this way before, not at a state banquet, not before foreign ambassadors. but the same ugliness that erupted inside St. George's Hall that evening had already surfaced behind palace walls, and the people who should have stopped it had chosen instead to ignore it and welcome him right back inside. Who Freddie Parker Bowles is, and the history that put him in that room several months before the banquet, a private function was held inside Clarence House, one of the official royal residences in London. Freddie attended as a family guest. A junior member of the serving staff had been assigned to the table where Freddie was seated. At one point during the evening, Freddie made a request, and the staff member, who was managing several tables at once, took slightly longer than expected to respond. What Freddie did next shocked everyone nearby. He looked directly at the staff member and said, loudly enough for guests at the neighboring table to hear that people in his position existed to serve, and if he could not manage that properly, then he had no place in a house like this. Freddie delivered the remark with the flat, practiced coldness that does not come from momentary anger, but from truly believing the person standing before you does not matter. The staff member finished his shift in silence and went home. The following morning, he filed a formal written complaint through the proper internal channels, explaining exactly what had been said and how it had been delivered. A senior member of Camilla's household received the complaint, thanked the staff member for raising it, and then quietly ensured it stayed buried and out of any records accessible to William and Catherine's household. The staff member who had trusted the institution to take his complaint seriously was essentially told, through the language of administrative silence, that his experience did not matter enough to be formally acknowledged. When Tom Parker Bowles was informed about the Clarence House incident by Camilla, his reaction was not concern for the staff member. His son had humiliated before a room full of people. His reaction was irritation that the complaint had gone through formal channels at all, instead of being brought privately to the family first. He then contacted Camilla's household and pushed for the matter to be handled with as little visibility as possible. This was not a new pattern for Tom. It was the response he had relied upon whenever trouble appeared. In 1999, a journalist secretly posing as a businessman recorded Tom allegedly offering to supply cocaine at a private gathering. The recording reached a newspaper, and the story exploded at the worst possible moment for Camilla, right in the middle of her slow and difficult effort to rebuild her public image after the devastation of the Charles and Diana years. The palace moved swiftly, and the controversy was absorbed and contained. Tom walked away without facing any meaningful consequence. Camilla was protected, and the public moved on. What that moment engraved into the Parker Bowles family was a belief they never fully abandoned. It taught them that silence works, that the institution will protect you if you become quiet quickly enough and allow the machine to swallow the problem whole. Tom had lived as proof of that since 1999, and he had raised his son beneath that same unspoken guarantee. But what neither Freddie nor Camilla had fully reckoned with was this. The institution now contained a different kind of woman, and she had already decided she would not become another wall behind which this family could hide. Catherine did not cross that room to offer a polite suggestion. What she did in front of 150 witnesses, including foreign ambassadors whose role is to observe and remember everything, was something no one seated inside St. George's Hall had ever witnessed. The walk across the room, Catherine's intervention, and what it cost. Camilla, the most unsettling thing about the way Catherine moved through that room was how completely unhurried she was. She did not storm across the hall. She walked with a quiet, unwavering certainty that can be far more intimidating than anger because it tells you the person approaching has already decided how the story ends. Every footman who noticed her movement understood it instantly. Every guest who followed her with their eyes understood it too. There was no uncertainty about where Catherine was going or what she intended to do. The only question was how severe the consequences would be for the person she was. Approaching, Catherine reached Freddie and spoke in a calm, controlled voice that left no space for argument. She told him to leave immediately, through the side entrance, and to do so quietly. She would not allow him to turn the evening into something uglier than it already had become. Freddie never had the opportunity to defend himself, appeal to her, or seek support from anyone else. There was no negotiation, no hesitation, and no mercy. Catherine had already made her decision, and the only thing left for Freddie to do was walk out. He was escorted quickly through a side entrance. The empty space where he had been sitting seemed to close over as though he had never been there at all. The footmen continued their work. The music continued playing, and conversations around the Tables resumed with the careful, measured restraint of people who had just witnessed something unforgettable and were collectively pretending, for the sake of the evening, that nothing unusual had occurred. What made that walk carry so much meaning extended far beyond Freddie and beyond that single night. Years earlier, Diana had watched a member of the extended royal family behave badly during a private royal dinner, embarrassing guests and leaving the room deeply uncomfortable. Afterward, Diana raised the matter with a member of the household and was quietly told these situations were better managed internally and discreetly. Away from wider attention, Diana accepted that advice. She spent the following decade inside an institution that repeatedly asked her to absorb things quietly, and by the time the cost of all that silence became visible to the world, it was too late to undo the damage. Catherine was absorbing nothing. She was refusing, openly and visibly, and she was wearing Diana's jewels on her wrist while doing it. Camilla watched every step of that walk. She was in the room. She witnessed every moment, and what appeared across her face when Catherine turned and returned to her seat went far beyond the embarrassment of a grandmother whose grandson had misbehaved at dinner. Her grandson had just been removed from a state banquet before the very institution she had spent 20 brutal years fighting to be accepted by. Camilla had sacrificed privacy, endured public hostility, and spent more than a decade as one of the most criticized women in Britain to secure her place within those walls, and now her own grandson had ripped through everything she had built, in the most public and irreversible way imaginable, in a room filled with people whose impressions of the monarchy would likely be recorded in diplomatic reports by morning. But Camilla did not sit quietly with any of it. Nobody who had watched her survive what she survived would have expected her to. She waited until the guests had gone. Then she came with everything she had. What followed in that confrontation made Freddie's removal look gentle by comparison. The palace closes. Catherine does not. Within 6 hours of that banquet, Camilla's household had quietly made contact with at least 3 senior royal correspondents in the British press. The calls were framed as off-the-record background briefings. Nothing attributed, nothing on paper. The message delivered through those calls was carefully constructed and deliberately shaped. The incident had been minor. It had been handled swiftly and appropriately. Any suggestion of a serious confrontation between senior members of the royal family was, according to the briefing, a gross exaggeration. 2 of the 3 journalists who received those calls chose not to publish anything. The third made a quiet note of the contact in their own files and also stayed silent. But all 3 journalists understood something immediately the moment their phones rang. Nobody calls that quickly, and nobody works that hard to shape a story over something minor. The urgency from Camilla's household to shrink the narrative became, in itself, the loudest indication that the story mattered. The briefing meant to make the incident disappear only, reinforce that something serious had taken place, yet there were places the palace machine could not reach, and what existed inside those places was not going away. The foreign diplomatic staff attending that banquet were required, as part of their professional duties, to file internal reports on official events they attended. Those reports do not belong to the British palace. They belong to the governments that assigned those diplomats to London. Reports filed after that evening by staff from at least 2 diplomatic missions reportedly referenced the incident directly. One report, described by a source familiar with its contents, specifically mentioned a young male guest connected to the British royal family who behaved in a manner wholly incompatible with the dignity of the occasion and who treated serving staff in a demeaning and contemptuous way before senior diplomatic guests. That language, formally written and permanently archived inside a foreign government record, does not fade. It cannot be managed away through a background briefing or softened by a quiet phone call. It remains there. And if such material ever surfaced through a diplomatic leak or a freedom of information process, it could become an international story with Camilla's name attached and little room left to challenge the written record. The British Foreign Office reportedly became aware of those diplomatic reports within days of the banquet. A senior official contacted a palace liaison and flagged that the evening had generated formal documentation in external government archives beyond palace authority. The palace acknowledged the contact and stated that the matter had been handled internally. According to internal communication, The Foreign Office noted that the palace response addressed none of the substance described in those diplomatic reports. The reports remained on file, and they remain there now. Catherine likely understood that silence would arrive by morning. She acted anyway, because the point was never simply about what newspapers might print. The point was that everyone inside St. George's Hall that night now knew exactly who had stepped forward when the line needed holding. King Charles is aging, and his health has become a matter of growing public discussion. The question of what the monarchy looks like in its next chapter is no longer distant or theoretical. It is the live backdrop against which decisions inside Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace are increasingly viewed. And against that backdrop, at a state banquet attended by foreign ambassadors whose written observations now sit permanently in government archives, the person who made it unmistakably clear that she understood what the institution demanded and was willing to enforce it was Catherine. The monarchy rarely changes through dramatic announcements. It changes through the slow accumulation of moments when someone inside it refuses to look away. Camilla built much of her survival around the belief that the walls always hold, that quiet management protects everyone, and that institutions absorb problems if the noise is controlled quickly enough. But she now exists inside an institution where one of those walls appears to have developed a spine and a name, and that name is Catherine, the Night Catherine. Crossed St. George's Hall wearing Princess Diana's jewels and removed Freddie Parker Bowles from that banquet before 150 witnesses. Many in that room felt something shift beneath them. The era they had been living through no longer felt untouched. It already seemed to be changing.